Thank you, Adrian, for this very beautiful paper, which for me raises a set of questions about how to think the relations between protocols and infrastructures, which is rather than think of protocols within infrastructures, to think of them as somehow separate tenets that can become a kind of productive tension. We're continuing with a presentation by Luis Moreno, who many of you already met yesterday. Luis is an urbanist who works at University College London's Urban Lab, and much of whose work of late has been around what he's called the architecture of financial ruin, the way in which the economic crisis of the past 5 years has completely rewritten the urban surface and its inhabitation. So, Luis.
Thanks, Irit. I just need to get up the presentation a sec. Okay, you can see that. Okay, hi. Thanks to Maria for making me feel so welcome at the Former West Conference, and thank you to Irit and to my co-conspirators on the infrastructure strand. Like some of the other contributions on this strand, what I'm going to say is it's not going to come out of directly actually this research, the PhD research I'm doing on financialization and urbanization. What I was very excited about when Irit invited me to respond to this notion of infrastructure, or to set it up as a problematic, was to explore some things which are at the edges of the thesis, at the edges of my interest in kind of financialization and urbanization. And there's a very particular interest that I haven't been able to address, which is the issue about the kind of subjectivity, or the kind of, as you were saying yesterday, Irit, the kind of infrastructure of feeling which comes out of these kind of processes that Stefano was talking about these algorithmic institutions, rather than just thinking about these as totalizing purely technocratic processes which are at odds with cultural activity. How do these things generate cultures? How do these things generate forms of subjectivity and also modes of alienation which generate a new kind of politics? And because I'm an urbanist and because I'm working in the fields of kind of architecture, planning, but really a kind of geography and thinking about the kind of political economy of geography, my area of interest, or how I triangulate these issues, is around thinking about the city, or what Henri Lefebvre would call the urban. And what I want to do is set up a kind of a dialectic between the way in which in the 1970s geographers and sociologists began to problematize or reconfigure and reconstruct Marx's analysis of capitalism around what Manuel Castells called the urban question. And this was inspired by Henri Lefebvre's kind of analysis of the way in which the French state had kind of responded to the historical conjuncture of the post-war era, what Ernest Mandel called neo-capitalism, and what he later called late capitalism. But he said that it had a spatial form to it. So as well as politics existing purely at the level of a superstructure, or that culture and politics interact with one another purely at the level of superstructure, Henri Lefebvre said, no. If we want to talk about reproduction in the way in which Althusser was formulating in an institutional analysis. We need to go to the source and understand the form of the city and the way in which the form of the city encapsulated this. And therefore, Lefebvre was bringing into a critical engagement with the forms of technocracy in which planning, architecture were implicated, not necessarily responding to ideology, but producing an ideology which was a basic set of social conditions in which politics happened, or set the kind of, he wouldn't have used this language then, but the kind of bandwidth for politics. This was kind of, politics was constructed within the urban. Now what I want to do is I want to think about the way in which, obviously the conditions in which Lefebvre was writing and thinking about the city, the kind of modernist city, the city that responded to the problems of full employment, of a Keynesian type economy, how that has transformed recently. And so I've set up this other image from a Scientific American article from last year, which seems to suggest a different kind of process, which is around the urban being the way in which it resolves problems. The conventional kind of discourse that I think Lefebvre was responding to was the idea that the urban infrastructure is a problem. Now there's a discourse, and a kind of triumphalist discourse, and that one which takes place at the level of kind of technological innovation, talks about economic growth, as cities are both the cause and effect of technological superiority and free enterprise and capital accumulation. So you have this kind of idea that cities are a kind of spatial technology, a spatial infrastructure, because it harnesses the individual capacities of people, right? And there's this interest now in economics, in mainstream economics, in people, and something that Stefano was talking about yesterday, kind of externality type effects. Or I think that was something that came from the audience, actually, thinking about externalities. Economists now are very interested in not necessarily investing in kind of factories and equipment and technology, but the potential that each of you have within you to produce an innovation. And the idea is, if we can internalize that somehow within a system, within a kind of an infrastructure, that's how economies kind of grow. So I want to play these two forms of analysis off one another, because I think they tell us something quite interesting about the kind of economic structures that exist both at a kind of a material level, but also a kind of new and recent kind of move into the subject, or there's this kind of specious proximity that I think technology wants to have with our feelings and kind of desires. And I think this is an interesting way of reflecting on a very old notion in political economy about the economic subjectivity of markets, of the consumer, the notion of homo economicus. So this talk really is kind of stimulated by a really remarkable book, Foucault's lectures on the birth of biopolitics, and it's a really funny book actually, because he says right at the beginning, he says, right, I want to get to this problem here about biopolitics, what it is, about the way in which the basic material requirements of everyday life, how this becomes a new field, or a primary field in which power can assert itself. But he says, before I can do that, I need to talk about the way in which liberalism has transformed itself more recently into this new mode of neoliberalism around a critique of the state. And it's very interesting, because it's essentially Foucault's book on political economy. I know it's a series of lectures, but it's in a way Foucault's kind of engagement with neo-Marxian political economy. And what's very interesting about it is, I think there's a tendency within critical theory to think about neoliberalism in a kind of stereotyped way. And Foucault, in this book, he says that the problem with critical theory, and I think he's talking about Marcuse really, is that there's a tendency in which there's a set of kind of he calls them cold monsters that critical theorists have about the state, about certain figures, like the police force. And he says these things exist as kind of static entities. But what we need to do, he seems to be suggesting, is think about the way in which these things are always in jeopardy, and that their strength comes because they're constantly anxious and they're constantly trying to recombine themselves and reformulate and reassert themselves. And I think what's interesting about this approach is that it gives us a way of thinking about neoliberalism, not just as the figure of PricewaterhouseCoopers, always knowing, always understanding what it is they want to do. But they are fragile figures. They are figures who are kind of riven with anxiety, and that there is a possibility for disruption and a response to this kind of power. So he's got this. It's a very interesting line from Foucault, because he's saying, okay, actually, let's enjoy the analysis that Marx gives us. So he says, to summarize in these lectures, I'd like to say that if it's true that a feature of the modern world since the 18th century really has been the constant presence of what might be called the crises of capitalism. And in these lectures, actually, he's drawing on the work of the Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter. But Schumpeter's analysis of crisis comes essentially from Marx. He says, couldn't we also say that there have been crises of liberalism which are not, of course, independent of the crises of capitalism? And it's a very interesting way, I think, of thinking about neoliberalism and liberalism, is that liberalism, political economic thought, exists purely as a critique of the state. So he says, I don't want to think about the state as a pre-existing object. I want to look at it as a kind of an emptiness and a void which is circumscribed and patrolled by an economic critique. And that is the way in which economists galvanize their kind of strength, is around the fact that they provide a way of kind of patrolling the boundaries and perimeters of what the state is. And that's where they get their power and force. Now, switching to Henri Lefebvre. Henri Lefebvre generated an analysis which was akin to this in relation to the notion of space and urbanization. And what he talked about, and it was a response to what he called the eruption or the explosion of May 1968, was the role that the urban, the city had in both formalizing and providing a form of kind of precepts, really, for the state, but that this was kind of riven with kind of catastrophe and the potential for explosion. So when Lefebvre became a professor of sociology at Nanterre, which was a new town, a new suburb of Paris, he could see that this kind of modernist formalization, that there was a kind of a surplus to it, which was not contained within the modernist architecture, that could generate something which could explode. And indeed, the May 1968 revolutions came out of, or started in Nanterre with some of the student revolts in the suburbs and moved into the city. But Lefebvre took this further, rather than it just being simply a description of the way in which capitalism kind of operates. He said that it's something about the way in which space is being produced nowadays that tells you something about a more immediate relationship that capitalism has with its subjects, with labor power. And so he says, what has happened is that capitalism has found itself able to attenuate its internal contradictions, and consequently, since in 100 years since the writing of Capital, it has succeeded in achieving growth. We cannot calculate at what price, but we do know the means: by occupying space, by producing a space. And what Lefebvre was kind of suggesting here is that what capitalism isn't ever an attempt to resolve its internal contradictions. The problem of the market, the problem of uncertainty, is precisely where the value and the power and the force of capital is found. And what producing space does, what the ability to generate, a physical infrastructure that can kind of harness the collective subject in the form of a city, what it does is it provides a way of managing these problems. And remember, he was talking about a particular period. But this kind of analysis, to some degree, was being developed separately in the United States. And if you think about somebody like Robert Moses, who kind of a planner and politician, probably the paradigmatic example of a kind of an urban politician, urban planner, kind of a houseman of mid-20th century New York, is that you see that these aren't spatial infrastructures of feelings, right? These are just spatial infrastructures, but they generate a certain effect. And that Robert Moses, for somebody like Jane Jacobs, had a very different analysis to Henri Lefebvre, represented a certain kind of outline of power. But anyway, what's interesting about the 1970s is that you've got radicals like Jane Jacobs, she's definitely not a Marxist. She's very interested in innovation. But she's not interested actually too much in the social relations of production as Marx would describe it. Meeting minds really in the text that they produce with somebody like Henri Lefebvre, who is definitely interested in social relations of production. And they make a kind of analysis about the way in which the kind of infrastructure which reproduces capitalism at this moment provides a kind of an outline of a problem. And David Harvey, a Marxist geographer who comes from England to Baltimore in the early 1970s, and he's writing alongside Lefebvre, even though at the time he says he wasn't aware of Lefebvre's work, starts to develop a very interesting analysis about the American urban crisis. Harvey was writing about Baltimore, but I think if you look at the Great Rebellion, say, of Detroit of the late 1960s, and how the immediate response to it, it's very interesting. There's an immediate response by capital, which is to generate a kind of LA-type fix for the city, which is what you get in the John Portman building for the Detroit Renaissance Center. But anyway, what Harvey produces is a very interesting analysis which kind of echoed the economic anthropologist Karl Polanyi, who said that what capitalism requires is a basic set of resources in order to reproduce itself: labor, land, and money. And that these things need to be pre-packaged, pre-presented as commodities, as market commodities. But Polanyi was saying that none of these is actually produced for sale. They're not actually fruits of nature which are packaged up for the market. They have to be, he was saying, politically produced. There needs to be politics in place in order to ensure that land, labor, and money are these basic economic resources. So to talk about these factors as basic commodities, he says, is entirely fictitious. And that's an idea which Harvey develops. And you can see that this analysis that capitalism constantly requires spatial fixes for this problem of recombining the basic elements of labor, land and money. It has been the story of the continuous set of kind of economic crises we've seen since the 70s and the 1980s. As Harvey said back in 1973, an analysis which kind of complemented Lefebvre's, he said a space economy has to be created and maintained if urbanism is to survive as a social form. He says the conception is more instructive. So this idea of doing a kind of an analysis of the way in which the economy works as an embodied material set of practice which capitalists are constantly involved with, and they're constantly involved in the political system because they need to ensure that the commodities of land, labor and money are always available on the market. So it's always a political process. He says this analysis is much more convincing and kind of rational in a way than the stock analysis of political economy, classical political economy and modern economics, which rests on Adam Smith's notion that everything can be explained by consumer demand and gains from trade. It says it's more realistic to model an urbanized space economy as a surplus creating, extracting and concentrating device. And more recently, we've got this kind of example, with very familiar examples with Dubai that had to be bailed out because its economy was essentially based not around basic commodities like oil, but it was based around a real estate economy. But these types of real estate economy do generate real cultural effects. And so you've got the world's tallest building, the Burj Khalifa. But the flip side of this type of activity is that it is linked into a kind of a reflux, a throwing out of labor. So the kind of economic crisis which generates that kind of form, like Burj Khalifa, also generates a social reflux in terms of the protests that you have in the Eurozone. There's a systemic relationship between the urban culture of protest and resistance by the unemployed and this kind of triumphalist kind of spatial fix that takes this kind of very distorted and sublime architectural form. But how these two things link together, I think, is a problem. But this is, in a way, is a very interesting issue to think about the way in which space of the city modulates with the undulations and the roiling processes of capitalism on a global scale. So you've got this idea then, which came out of the 1970s, about the city as the space in which capital is both produced and reproduced, and the notion that what's fundamental is this constant recombination and manipulation of the social relations of production. And it's an idea which is central to Marx's thinking, in the idea of primitive accumulation, that before capitalism can respond in a sophisticated way through industrial development and technological change, it has to have its hands on the basic factors of production. And David Harvey's revitalized this notion with accumulation by dispossession. And this idea has had a certain resonance, I think, with the recent Occupy protests. And it's linked up with Lefebvre's notion of the rights of the city. So if Marx is correct to say that the human essence is in reality the ensemble of social relations, and that the city or the urban is the basis in which these social relations are reproduced, then before they're marketized, there's an opportunity to engage. There might be a new politics, urban politics, that comes out of this. So this politics, I think, is very interesting. It's spatial, it's urban, and and you've seen it expressed in the Occupy campaigns, both in London, Manhattan, but also theorists have tried to connect it with the Arab Spring as well. And also, I think this kind of analysis generated a cultural response. And I think Hans Hacker's work in the early 1970s, so at the same time as Lefebvre, and at the same time that David Harvey, as a geographer, is trying to get his head around how Marx applies to the American urban crisis, Hans Hacker is doing something within the register of art by trying to present the social relations behind the kind of slum landlord system of New York. And it's a wonderful title. It's Sapolsky et al., Manhattan Real Estate Holdings, a Real-Time Social System, as of May the 1st, 1971. And this generates a real kind of crisis for the institution, because there was this suggestion, by presenting this kind of analysis into the art world, there's this suggestion that the art world's implicated in this kind of accumulation by dispossession processes. And also Stodela, a very interesting recent piece, I think, is a kind of an up-to-date type cultural spatial analysis in its analysis of the way in which the decision-making processes which went into the Gazprom tower in St. Petersburg. And I just want to play a clip from this before I move to the second part of the talk. It gives you a sense of the way in which this kind of analysis is part of actually a form of kind of cultural production in order to make visible this field of political and economic power. Is there some way of getting the volume up?
символ. Символ, который не только отражает современность, но и указывает дорогу в будущее. Символом новой, модернизированной России станет башня «Газпрома», возведенная на величественных брегах Невы в прекрасном городе Петербурге. 403 метра. Это высота, достойная новой России. Эта башня будет возвышаться над городом, как негасимый маяк, указывающий нам путь. С башни «Газпрома» наша жизнь изменится к лучшему. Россия, вперед! Дорогие друзья, уважаемые коллеги, позвольте открыть наше совещание. Во-первых, хочу вас всех поздравить. Мы будем строить башню «Газпрома». Нашу башню.
Закон и культура, что может быть свыше. Закон и культура. Мы любим все новое, модное, надоело старье. Давай небоскреб, Россия вперед. Не допустим искусственных новых построек. Сохраним облик города, его небесная линия света. Его небесная линия света. Надоело старье, давай небоскреб. Небесная линия света спасет наш город от жадных застройщиков. «Газпром», остановись! Это преступление!
Долой буржуазный газоскреб! Даешь коммунистический небоскреб! Требуем социальный план развития города!
Это наш город!
Нам все равно, стройте что хотите, лишь бы зарплату платили, но чуркам, которых вы привезете на стройку, здесь не жить, здесь не жить!
Надоело старье, давай небоскреб. Россия вперед! Мы за или против, это ничто не решает.
Ничто не решает!
Ничто не решает!
But I think this kind of analysis is important because obviously this kind of urban modernization process is still with us and is still fundamental to the way in which capitalism works. So capitalism requires these spatial fixes, and their most obvious form is tall buildings, skyscrapers, and a management of the external environment. But I think what Foucault was getting at in his analyses on neoliberalism is that that the notion of freedom is a way of not only policing the levels of potential and possibility of politics, but that the notion of liberalism in relation to the systemic problems that the capitalism creates for itself. So the systemic problems it has in order to kind of manage these basic relations of production constantly requires to be patched up, constantly requires what we might call a kind of, alongside a spatial fix, a kind of a cognitive fix. And the way in which we might think of neoliberalism is not just a set of kind of rules or a new agenda that's formulated in the 1970s, but is a kind of an active, autonomous field of kind of problem solving of these basic systemic problems of capitalism. It's a way of government constantly kind of rebooting itself and reformulating itself. So as well as the urban revolution that Lefebvre's talking about in the late 60s and the 1970s, which is essentially an idea of how can the urban, again this idea of Marx about the reality of humanity, its essence is as an ensemble of social relations. You know, the proposition, the Marxist proposition, is that this provides a wonderful, joyful mode of political action, and also a kind of a strategic, rational response. But what's interesting over the last 20 years is that you've seen global institutions like the International Monetary Fund and also the World Bank becoming very interested in a kind of planetary global demographic shift towards urban settlements, and their interest, and they talk about an urban revolution. I think it's very interesting in thinking about the way in which their interests is not necessarily ideological. Is they're interested in a kind of the way in which this urban shift, this natural social demographic shift towards what seems a very democratic institution, the city, provides a wonderful way in which the project of globalization and international markets can go on indefinitely. And I think this process of the urban revolution coincides then with something we were talking yesterday about cultural infrastructure and also the policies that fund cultural institutions. You know, the idea of innovation and creativity, the idea of innovation maps onto the cultural sphere through the notion of creativity. And so you have discourse by management theorists, essentially, who wake up to the value of cultural institutions. And so they're your kind of PricewaterhouseCoopers types in a way. They say, well, actually not just what's interesting about the fixed capital of the museum building, all its symbolic value, but what's its productive value in future for a post-industrial economy. And it's interesting that they've modulated the register of economics as well. And they say, well, it's not about fundamental resources, because if you're an advanced industrial economy, you want to get out of that. And what you want to do is export ideas, and you can buy your shirts and shoes from the developing world. And what we'll export to them back is ideas. So the basic resources, it says, is to do with culture, innovation, and they replace assets like coal, steel, or gold. Creativity is the method of exploiting these resources and helping them grow. So creativity becomes a kind of a transmission mechanism. And then this maps onto, in the UK context, a kind of the notion of an urban renaissance. So the notions of regeneration and all the rest of it. So these ideas, though, don't just come from management theorists. What's very interesting about them, and especially in the way they've been encapsulated recently in bestsellers like Edward Glazer's The Triumph of the City. Edward Glazer is a Harvard school, is a Harvard economist, but is essentially a Chicago school economist. He was trained by Robert Lucas, who was trained by Milton Friedman. And it's very interesting that all of these economists became interested in a particular moment in the 1980s by the critique that Jane Jacobs produced of the modernist city and planning. And the idea was that actually some of the problems of mainstream economic theory was that it hadn't taken into account the creative capacities of individuals. So rather than just seeing them as passive consumers, the idea was that if we could somehow model the creativity of individuals and the way in which they mobilize themselves in resolving a desire for a product and service with that actual product and service that's presented to them as a product, then this would provide a more grounded, they call them micro foundations, for economic theory. So you've got this proposition that Robert Lucas presents in 1985, that economic life is creative in much the same way as art and science, and the force we need to postulate to account for the central role of cities is external human capital. So your ideas, your whims, your fantasies, if they translate into a market requirement from somebody you don't know, becomes a very exciting proposition within economics. And it sits on the back burner for a while, but it has, I think, kind of crystallized into not just an ideology, because it's not a particular spatial or architectural form they're interested in, or a particular set of politics. It's about generating a set of rules that could be managed and modified geographically. So you've got this strange phenomena now of the economist seeing themselves not necessarily as artists, but definitely as urbanists. So there's a guy called Paul Romer who produced a very influential theory in the 1980s and the early 1990s about growth, a new way of thinking about growth based on individuals' educational capacity and the way in which education interacts and knowledge interacts with one another, and that being the essential kind of value of capital. He's now left behind the institution and has become an urbanist, and he's now working in Honduras, setting up a special economic reform zone in Honduras that he calls charter cities. But this process then is linked up with a whole global industry of spatial production. So from knowledge villages, it's interesting as well that in Dubai they're building villages at a fairly massive scale. But so that you've got this idea that you've got a Greenwich Village type model that you build in Dubai. So you have a knowledge village, which is a convivial place for the exchange of ideas, but as a kind of a Dubai-style spatial product. That you can map this onto a Birmingham creative city proposal. It's spatial fix for an industrial declining place. And the World Bank talks about geography being a kind of a medium, as a medium in which you can kind of manipulate and expand the abilities of a place to generate capital. And the kind of capital they're looking for is what they call human capital. So they're looking to attract the most talented and the smartest people to come to their city. So you've got this competition now, spatial competition, to have the smartest places on Earth. Okay. So this is a new type of urban revolution then. So it's a race for not just highest and best land values, but this is linked into getting the best and smartest people. So it's an accumulation by dispossession process, because the idea is you want to accumulate the most knowledgeable, wealthy people in your place, but it doesn't really talk about what happens to the rest of us, or even how that education is acquired. Is that education being dispossessed from somebody else, and how's that being processed? That's not on the agenda in these kind of discussions. Now, London is the kind of primary example of this kind of process taken to a kind of an extreme at the moment. And you've got building projects, luxury housing, even though there's a massive housing crisis, obviously, in London, which has been engineered to some degree because housing is such an amazing kind of asset to concentrate and centralize wealth. That you have building projects like One Hyde Park, which is kind of like hyper super gentrification, really. And that the idea is, and it's on the hoarding, is that the building, and it's not really in the form, it's just in the kind of aspiration, is about pushing the margins of consumption. And the idea that that this kind of process of luxury consumption is in a way where the avant-garde is, so that this kind of cosmopolitan class have kind of assumed the role of an avant-garde, because they're the ones who are involved in changing perceptions of what defines true luxury. So if we've got the right to the city, which is the kind of antagonistic kind of response to the kind of capitalism which is being defined and reproduced on a global scale, then there's an analysis which comes out of a critique of modernism and infrastructure, but is now it's called The Triumph of the City. And it's a normative theory which suggests that urbanization and the urban is fundamental to economic growth. So I'll just conclude then with some remarks about, if we put these two pieces together then, this notion of mainstream theory that the way in which economies can resolve these kind of systemic problems of capitalism is through essentially a cognitive fix. How does this map onto a more substantive Marxist analysis of a spatial fix? And again, if I come back to London, what's interesting, I think, is not the forms of the building necessarily. Even though the City of London has learned to love tall buildings, it had a problem for many years. It's only very recently it started to build skyscrapers. Actually, what's more interesting is the kind of rhetoric which goes with these buildings. So there's the Heron Tower in the City of London, and it calls itself an advanced business life environment. And I think this level of, again, I don't think it's necessarily rhetoric. It's just that it seems to be like a diagrammatic articulations of the way in which capital is generating a form for itself and a way of engaging with the public, because it is very interested in the public sphere. It's interested in the urban. Suggests, I think, a quite handy kind of conceptual slogan in which to understand the process of urbanization and what's happening now. So what are the aesthetics then of an advanced business life environment? What does it feel like? What is, as Irit was talking about yesterday, an infrastructure of feeling? What is the culture which comes naturally out of these kind of algorithmic institutions? And I want to suggest, and it's maybe obvious, but I think it's worth looking at this video and thinking about, when we're talking about infrastructure, what kind of infrastructure is this?
Okay, Glass, record a video.
This is it. We're on in 2 minutes.
Okay, Glass, hang out with the Flying Club.
Google photos of tiger heads.
You ready? You ready?
Right there. Okay, Glass, take a picture.
That is awesome.
Okay, Glass, record a video!
After this bridge, first exit.
Stay delicious in time.
Arroy.
Arroy.
Google jellyfish. Let's see. It's beautiful.
Okay, so I want to suggest that there's been a lot of commentary on Google Glass, which is essentially a wearable browser, making you and your experiences a form of browsing, iterant, probe-head, to explore the world for all it's worth. But I want to suggest this isn't an Orwellian model, and it's not just a kind of a stock, hackneyed version of a kind of Foucauldian analysis of panopticism. Because it's not about enclosing you, the wearers of Google Glass, in a structure. It's about optimizing your ability to investigate the world, but having that linked to a kind of cognitive analytical process. And I think this is a kind of an interesting dimension about the way in which space as a kind of a temporal and biological reality, everyday life, right? is becoming kind of internalized now within a notion of a market. So just to end, I want to suggest that what we have here is Homo economicus not just being a kind of a principle of rationalization in order to understand the market as an abstract phenomenon that can inform politics. We have a notion of Homo economicus now which is coming to life, and that this represents, I think, a limit point maybe then for politics, that I'm not talking about we need to resist Google Glass wearing, because it's quite obvious, you just don't wear it, right? But I think that this tendency is interesting, because it suggests that theory and knowledge are not being applied in a fairly kind of standard way, that the way in which the market operates, in which we need in order to get by and go about our everyday lives, are becoming absorbed into these processes. So I want to suggest there are kind of two figures that we might, or three figures, or millions of figures that give us this kind of outline of the notion of economic rationality, of economic subjectivity. And they're both shielded from view, or they're all shielded from view. So you don't see the figure in the Google Glass because it's an everyman type figure. But also on the streets of Athens, you've got the unspecified enemies who are not required by capital because their labour power is redundant. But what they do have a value as what Marx would call industrial reserve armies. But essentially, it's an urbanised reserve army, which is required in order to depress the value of labour power, so that social struggle around work becomes meaningless because it's devalued. And then this is reflected in the kind of, if we want to talk about Simone Forti, maybe this is the kind of zero tone of the aspiration of a market model, of this kind of the figure who owns real estate looking out over the city. And this is a piece of advertising from the Heron Tower. And so what you have is I think something which is quite akin to what Foucault was getting at in these lectures on his critique of neoliberalism. Homo economicus is an entrepreneur of himself, being for himself his own capital, being for himself his own producer, being for himself the source of his earnings. And I think this isn't necessarily the stuff of politics. It seems to be now the stuff of aspiration, but also cultural production. And therefore, it's a kind of an invasive, I think, cognitive infrastructure that requires a kind of response in order to not only reveal it, but to present a different understanding of the social ensemble, which can fundamentally tackle the real questions and provide the real opportunities that can turn the city into, or the urban, into something which is the stuff of the revolutionary becoming of everyday life. Thank you.